Victorian England stood as the shining example of a mercantilist empire, with the largest capital in the world, London, as its center. Those that made a sizable income from doing business with that empire lived a life of luxury and borderline decadence. It seemed that between the stately gentlemen and glamorous ladies of the time held standards only seen by the outside world. Deep within most of these households of these seemingly happily married couples existed many secrets, with some of them being deadly. A young American woman who marries a wealthy and influential cotton merchant sees through time that her marriage is a failure and her husband is not the man she married. Florence Maybrick sought a way to exit from an unhappy marriage from a man who not only portrayed himself as a fine, upstanding citizen in Victorian society, but also held a dark secret. Did Florence Maybrick see a tragic end to her husband's deeds, or was it a result of his deviant lifestyle? And was her husband's secret one that would be exposed over 100 years after his death, and bring to a close one of the greatest mysteries in crime history?
Florence Elizabeth Chandler was born in Mobile, Alabama, a real Southern belle. Her father, George Chandler, was a partner in the banking firm of St. John Powers and Company, and at one time served as the mayor of Mobile. Her father died before Florence's birth, and her mother remarried in 1872, for the third time, to Baron Adolf von Rokas, a cavalry officer in the 8th Cuirassier Regiment of the German Army. While on a steamship journey to Europe in 1880, the 17-year-old Florence caught the attention of a Liverpool cotton merchant named James Maybrick. Maybrick was smitten with the young Southern belle, and within a year, the two married. Florence seemed to make a great impression on Maybrick's friends and contacts within the social scene of Liverpool, and the Maybricks were invited to all the social gatherings and parties held by the wealthy of the area. But something never seemed right about the couple. James Maybrick learned earlier in his life that although one was married, the company of other young women made him feel virile and attractive, although he aged rapidly. One of the reasons for this aging appeared to be his misuse of patented medicines, as well as arsenic. This deadly poison was utilized by those who could afford an aphrodisiac. In small doses, it proved to prolong lovemaking, as well as provide a euphoric feeling to the occasional user. But Maybrick abused the drug quite frequently, even to the point that his wife could not satisfy his amorous levels. Maybrick sought the company of several mistresses, and one of them even bore him 5 children. Florence grew increasingly unhappy with her marriage and even sought the company of several liaisons herself. One of them, Alfred Brierly, became a known secret within Liverpool circles, and when James Maybrick discovered the affair, his treatment toward Florence became increasingly violent, especially after Florence announced to her irate husband that she would no longer engage in marital relations with him. Maybrick's behavior intensified toward his wife, generating a hatred toward all women. In April of 1889, Florence Maybrick purchased some flypaper at a local hardware store. When she arrived home, she soaked the flypaper within a bowl of water. Florence later claimed that this allowed her to extract arsenic for the legitimate cosmetic use. On April 27, 1889, Maybrick became very ill after self-administering a double dose of strychnine. After doctors visited Maybrick at Battle Crease, the house he rented for his family, the doctor's diagnosis was dyspepsia. Unfortunately, Maybrick's condition worsened. As Maybrick lay dying, on May 8th, Florence took the time to write a secretive letter to her lover, a letter that Maybrick nanny, Alice Yap, intercepted. At the time, James Maybrick's brother, Edwin, stayed at Battle Crease in Augberth, so Yap handed the letter to Edwin, a man by the way, who by all indications also carried on an affair with Florence. Edwin then gave the letter to Michael Maybrick, the virtual head of the Maybrick family. Michael then announced that Florence would not act in the stead of mistress of the house, and he placed her under house arrest. On May 9th, 1889, a housemaid made public that Maybrick had consumed what she termed Valentine's meat juice that contained a grain of arsenic. Later, Florence maintained that her husband requested the elixir as a pick-me-up. He never drank the contents. On May 11th, 1889, James Maybrick died. Immediately after his death, his brothers suspected foul play and strongly suggested that his body be examined. His body contained a small amount of arsenic, but not a dose that would be considered fatal. The examiner stated that they were not aware whether Maybrick ingested the amount on his own or whether the dosage was administered by someone else. After a coroner's inquest, authorities arrested Florence Maybrick for the murder of her husband, James Maybrick. At the time of her arrest, Mrs. Maybrick was unaware of the enemies against her. The Maybrick brothers searched the house at first and then searched the house with policemen. All of a sudden, it appeared that authorities brought arsenic out of every crevice in the residence. The house was allegedly a crime scene, and yet the authorities allowed members of the dead man's family to search the house, possibly fabricating and planting evidence and pointing the finger at Florence Maybrick. One envelope found at the scene was labeled "Poison for the Cats." Immediately, the persons present stated that this belonged to the widow. Untrue. Florence Maybrick adored cats and owned 3, with one as her constant companion. Maybrick was known as an abuser of arsenic, but the brothers did not want to hear this fact, even though they may have suspected or known themselves. For some reason, in reviewing the court records from Florence Maybrick's trial, one gets the impression that the deck had been stacked against her. Bruce Robinson, in his work They All Loved Jack, makes the case that Michael Maybrick and the Masonic Brotherhood framed both James Maybrick and Florence Maybrick. The Masonic Brotherhood wanted Maybrick out of the way because of his public display of mistresses, and his addiction to arsenic proved embarrassing to the organization. Additionally, Florence Maybrick, referred to as the whore by family members, embarrassed the family, and they sought a resurrection of their honor. Either way, the trial proved to be a travesty of justice. When the trial ended at St. George's Hall in Liverpool on July 25, 1889, the trial judge, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, a firm believer in the stiffest sentences for any criminal and a known misogynist, heard the verdict of guilty from the jury and thought long and hard about the sentence he would pronounce. Judge Stephen gave Mrs. Maybrick death. Later, her sentence was then commuted to life imprisonment at Woking and Aylesbury Prison. But on January 14, 1904, after so many British citizens protested the verdict from the end of the trial, Mrs. Florence Maybrick was granted a royal license, essentially a parole. Florence then returned to the United States, although she had forfeited her American citizenship when she married James Maybrick, and began touring the country on a lecture tour where she protested her innocence. Eventually, Florence worked as a housekeeper, rather unsuccessfully. She then became a recluse, living with her cats for company. Very few people knew her real identity, and she lived in a small, squalid 3-room cabin in Gaylordsville, South Kent, Connecticut. The woman who once had a charmed life in Liverpool, England during the Victorian era died without a cent to her name on October 23, 1941, and lays buried on the grounds of the South Kent School. The only thing among her possessions was a tattered family Bible. She never saw her children again, as they were raised by the family's doctor. Her son, who later became a mining engineer, died tragically in 1911 when he mistook a cyanide solution for a glass of water. Very few people knew that Florence Maybrick wrote a book about her experiences shortly after her release entitled My 15 Lost Years. The Liverpool City Libraries hold rare copies of the work.
Florence Maybrick sought an end to her suffering, but history records that her arrest, trial, and conviction appeared to be somewhat of a travesty. With her husband dead, her torment over, she sought the solace and anonymity of her home country. But was this the end to the story? Some 103 years after James Maybrick's death, one of the worst serial killers in crime history, Jack the Ripper, may have been uncovered with 63 pages written in a supposed diary discovered in the former home of the unhappy Mayricks, Battle Crease Manor. Was it the truth to end a mystery, or just a hoax that sought to perpetuate the myth of the world's most famous and unidentified serial killer?
The story of the alleged diary of Jack the Ripper began in 1991 in Liverpool, England. Mike Barrett, a disabled former ironworker, claimed that he frequented a bar in the city known as the Saddle Inn. While in that small pub, Barrett claimed that he befriended a fellow Liverpudlian and retired print worker named Tony Devereaux. At one of their meetings, Devereaux handed Barrett a brown paper package and stated, "There you are, mate. That's for you." Barrett did not know what to do with the package. Devereaux instructed him to take it home and do something with it. When Barrett arrived home, he unwrapped the package and discovered a leather-bound scrapbook with some pages missing from the front. The remaining pages contained writing, almost as if someone were keeping a journal of sorts. Barrett skimmed through the pages and began to surmise that these writings were not the work of an ordinary person. The pages contained almost a confession or testimonial of an unhappy man determined to avenge whatever wrong he documented at the time. When Barrett reached the last page, he realized what the journal contained. On the final page, the journal contained the signature of the affiant. It read, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Barrett believed, if true, this could be the end of history's most famous cold case. He began to research and strongly believed what he read was true. But before he could question Devereaux further as to the provenance of the journal, the older man died of a heart attack. Barrett became bewildered as to what to do with this possibly newfound treasure. Later, ripperologists, historians, and criminologists questioned where Barrett acquired this journal. Barrett swore at the time that he had no idea where Devereaux could have obtained such a find, but later, Barrett's estranged wife stated that her husband received the journal from her father, Barrett's father-in-law. The problem with the journal being authentic would fall to those who have studied the Ripper's crimes over a lifetime. After careful research and conclusive deductions, the author of the journal came to light, James Maybrick. Allegedly, while working at the Battle Crease Manor at the end of the 1980s, 3 electricians dug up the floorboards in order to renovate the property and discovered the journal there. Coincidentally, Barrett knew 2 of the electricians and even drank with them at the Saddle Inn. Once the contents began to be digested, it revealed a portrait of a tortured and borderline psychopath. It seems that the author may have been fueling his psychopathy with the use of the arsenic to which he felt addicted. With a document such as this, no stone can be unturned. Firstly, one had to discover the author's connection to the place where Jack the Ripper prowled, Whitechapel. Researchers discovered that Maybrick had several mistresses, even after his marriage to Florence, and that one of those mistresses lived in Whitechapel. In fact, Maybrick held a residence there for a time. Therefore, he would have been very familiar with the area. In order to determine whether Maybrick could have been Jack the Ripper and recorded his thoughts as they occurred, one must examine the motive for such recordations. It was well known that his wife Florence Maybrick took on a lover named Albert Brierly. When they met, could have determined one of the marks of the authenticity of the diary. At first, researchers thought that Florence and Brierly carried on their affair after they met in late 1888. However, later knowledge surfaced that the two had met in 1887. By the time the diary begins, assumed to be of March of 1888, they were already extremely friendly. The diary, with this point, demonstrated some historical accuracy. On August 31st, 1888, the first canonical victim, Mary Ann Polly Nichols, was discovered murdered at Buck's Row at approximately 4:25 a.m. In the diary, the author stated that he would not wait too long before indulging himself again. On September 8, 1888, the second canonical victim, Annie Chapman, was found lying near the steps in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. This time, the murderer seized her by the throat and made 2 deep gashes, instantly causing her death. While on her back, the murderer drew her legs up and lifted her skirt, forcing his knife into her stomach. This wound opened her bowels, and he then took out her intestines and placed them over her right shoulder. He removed part of her stomach wall, her womb, the upper part of her vagina, and most of her bladder. Although this murder proved to be brutal and gory, it seemed that the author of the diary may have been more intended to accomplish with Chapman's body. He stated that he took some of the organs with him and had intended to fry them and eat them. Later, the author stated that the organs did not taste like fresh bacon, but he enjoyed them nevertheless. At the crime scene, a detective, Joseph Chandler, discovered a crumpled piece of paper and a piece of torn envelope. On the envelope, the detective discovered written in a man's handwriting the letter M. Among the personal effects of the victim, the detective noticed 2 combs, a piece of muslin cloth, and 2 coins, farthings. The author made mention of this in the journal, and also that he may have taken the 2 brass rings from Chapman because they reminded him of his wife. Up until this point in the diary, there appeared very few mistakes, even if it were a forgery. After the Chapman murder, the Dear Boss letter famously arrived at the Central News Agency. One of the administrative heads of Scotland Yard at the time, Sir Robert Anderson, stated in his memoirs in 1910 that, "I will only add here that the Jack the Ripper letter, which is preserved in the Police Museum in Scotland Yard, is the creation of an enterprising journalist." Anderson never specified which Jack the Ripper letter he referred to in his memoirs. There were several, including the Lust letter, but later research confirmed that the Dear Boss letter had been rendered to Scotland Yard. On September 30th, 1888, the body of Elizabeth Stride, the third canonical victim, was discovered in Dutfield's yard at 40 Berner Street by Louis Deemschutz. Stride only had a deep cut to her throat. The author of the diary stated that he had not enough time to complete his work and that Deemschutz did not see the killer within the yard. The following night, a knife was discovered in Whitechapel Road, caked with dried blood. The coroner, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, stated that such a knife could have created the wounds found on Stride. With his disappointment at not being able to do with what he wanted with Stride's body, the author of the diary lamented,
"My heart felt as if it left my body. Within my fight, I imagined my heart bounding among the street, with I in desperation following it."
That same night, this desperation can be seen as 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes wandered into Mitre Square. Police Constable Edwin Watkins walked into the square not too long afterwards and discovered the mutilated remains of Catherine Eddowes. Her nose and lips had been ravaged. Her throat had been cut, and her abdomen had been ripped open with the left kidney and the uterus missing. From what the author wrote in the journal, demonstrated a thrill at mutilating her body. Under her eyes there appeared 2 deep inverted V's. When joined, they make an unmistakable M. This denoted that the killer and the author may have been playing games with the authorities. Allegedly, Maybrick left a few clues for the detectives at the Mitre Square murder scene. In inventorying Eddowes' belongings at the mortuary, the authorities listed a red cigarette case. This would not have any significance at the time, and of course until the revelation of the diary, but Maybrick supposedly kept his drugs in a red cigarette case, like the one found at the crime scene near Eddowes' body. Additionally, the journal referred to an empty tin matchbox with the victim's inventory as well. This fact was not made public until 1987. This may have indicated that if the journal was a forgery, it may have been written after 1987, or the journal was an authentic rendering. After the Eddowes murder, the author of the journal stated that he had taken a room in Middlesex Street. This was the dividing line between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police. Stride and Eddowes' bodies were divided in the districts. Early the next morning, a policeman walked on his beat past a doorway at 19 Goulston Street. There, he discovered the piece of a bloody and feces-filled apron. Above the apron, it appeared someone had written in chalk,
"The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
It appeared that whoever deposited the apron there had wiped off his knife and threw the apron to the ground. Did the murderer write the message, and why was the word Jews spelled incorrectly? The author of the diary stated that he meant it as a Jewish joke, yet throughout the diary he spelled Jews correctly. Later supposition made about the writing claimed that the word was supposed to spell James, not Jews. Although claims from the ripperology community tried to prove the falsity of the produced diary, it seemed that the more research they conducted, the more the authenticity of the diary proved true. The coincidences were just too many to ignore, and if this diary was fake, then the originator of the hoax received far more attention than anyone could have hoped. Additionally, those who, at first, judged the journal to be a hoax, gathered their thoughts and reasoned that this was not the type of diary that someone could forge. One would have to assume the personality of the author in order to write the words on the page. The writing seemed genuine and telling. A handwriting expert emphatically claimed that no one could emulate the characteristics of someone so disturbed as the author of the journal appeared to be at the time, and she found hypochondriac tendencies in the writer of the journal. This fit James Maybrick's personality. The handwriting itself seemed to present problems for those who defended the journal's authenticity. For example, the handwriting in the journal did not match any known handwriting samples of James Maybrick. The only other sample was Maybrick's last will and testament, and even this document had doubts as to whether he actually wrote it on his deathbed or it was dictated to and written by someone else. Again, the examiners of the journal drew other connections to the Dear Boss letter. Over the years, researchers believed that the Ripper may have had American connections due to certain colloquialisms used within that letter, predominantly Dear Boss itself. Maybrick lived in the United States until 1880 and frequently visited his offices there. It was also said that Maybrick left clues as to the origins of his hometown. For over 18 months, the arguments for and against the authenticity of the document rambled on. But one day, prior to the Diary of Jack the Ripper going to press, the publisher received a telephone call that they were in possession of a man's pocket watch. When the owner produced the watch, he opened the back panel, which revealed some scratchings. Very faintly, one could read, "I am Jack," and signed with James Maybrick's signature. But more hauntingly, the initials of the 5 canonical victims appeared on the panel as well, plus 2 more that the author of the journal claimed that he had killed. Researchers have been unable to ascertain the incidence of the 2 additional murders. But the revelation of the pocket watch demonstrated that the person who owned the watch, or made the scratchings, proved privy to information no one else could have known. At the Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, a leading metallurgy expert concluded that the scratches appearing on the panel of the watch were not done recently. Within some of the scratches appeared some microscopic brass samples, which led the expert to deduce that they had been left there many years before by the object used to do the scratches. A further forensic examination of the journal by ink and paper experts determined that it could have been written as early as 1921 or no more than 12 years earlier. But the same examiners also stated that because of atmospheric conditions, the journal could be much older. In October of 1888, there were no murders, but the author of the journal stated that he had been very unwell for a long period of time. But at the start of November, Maybrick's address in Middlesex became too hot. He allegedly stayed at his brother Michael's residence. This created problems for the author of the journal, as he was not able to commit murder at the time that he so desired. The author added that he became convinced that his mission came from God to murder all prostitutes. On the morning of November 9th, 1888, Thomas Boyer went to the dwellings of the last canonical victim, Mary Kelly. When he received no answer when he knocked at the door, he went around to the window and peered through the broken glass and the curtain. What he saw made him stutter. The form on the bed appeared to be human, and yet it appears parts of the body were scattered all about the room. The author of the diary left a clue. All one has to do is to view the only crime scene photo taken of one of the Ripper victims to see it as he described it in the journal.
I left it there for the fools, but they will never find it. I was too clever. Left it in front for all eyes to see.
Behind the victim's bed, scrawled upon the wall, lay the initials FM. Researchers believe that this stood for Florence Maybrick.
One has to ask the question, with so many coincidences, how can this journal seriously be considered a hoax? Mike Barrett, the man who came forward with the journal to begin with, later recanted his story about the provenance of the journal. When he confessed, at first, Barrett stated that he went to a flea market, bought an old photo album, tore out the first pages, and using old ink, had his wife write the diary based upon his research notes. But later, Barrett then stated that the journal was authentic, but by that time, no one believed him. 25 years after the release of the journal, author Robert Smith wrote another book that strongly claimed the journal to be the writings of Jack the Ripper. According to Smith, the book was found in 1992 by electricians working at Battle Crease House. Smith also asserted that Barrett had not the talent or the wherewithal to produce such a literary achievement. Therefore, Smith proclaims the writings so once scrutinized are really those of Jack the Ripper. However, in another work written by Bruce Robinson entitled They All Loved Jack, Busting Jack the Ripper, the author makes a convincing case for Jack the Ripper not being James Maybrick, but his brother Michael Maybrick. The motive? Frame his brother for the Whitechapel killings and make sure that Florence received the death penalty for the murder of his brother. A complicated plot, I know, but certainly one worth Victorian times. One question I kept asking myself 30 years ago when I first read The Diary of Jack the Ripper by Shirley Harrison is some of the medical examiners at the time of the murder stated that the Whitechapel murderer exhibited some anatomical or medical knowledge. No researcher has ever come forward to state that James Maybrick had this type of knowledge. And as a footnote to history, the judge in Florence Maybrick's trial, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, happened to have a son. His name was James K. Stephen, who happened to be the tutor of Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, Eddie, the Duke of Clarence, who has been named as a Ripper suspect, but has been proven to have been 300 miles away at the time the murders took place. Now, if you'd like to support us, we're on PayPal, GoFundMe, and Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Rumble. Look for us there. Until next time.